We worship God because of who God is. Period. I said we worship God because He is God. It is our love and submission to God that reveals that we understand the reality that God first loved us. Period. We worship God for who He is. We worship God because He first loved us. And so it is appropriate to thank God for all things that He has done for us, to include the authority that He placed in our lives. Let me say it again. To include the authority that He placed in our lives. We ought to thank Him. True worship is shallow if it is solely an acknowledgement of God's will. Psalms 96, put it up. Psalms 96, 5 through 6 gives us a reminder again of who God is. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. The 6th verse. Honor and majesty are before Him. Strength and beauty are in His sanctuary. Somebody say period. Period. In other words, splendor and majesty are before Him. Strength and glory are in His sanctuary. We honor God, we worship God, but it's strange for us to say that we honor and we worship God, but yet do not respect and reverence the delegated authority that God placed in our lives. In other words, our worship must be toward the one who is worthy simply because of His identity as omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. And not just because He is wealthy and able to meet our needs and to answer our prayers, but because of who He is. He is God. We must focus our practice of worship on the worthiness of God and not just His wealthiness. We must focus our practice of worship on honoring the fact that God places delegated authority in our lives to help us. Paul calls spiritual worship the reasonable act of a grateful heart. Worship has at least 2 distinct aspects, as I discussed with you on a couple of weeks ago. Adoration or praise and obedience or service. Worship must include those times when we celebrate God with praise and adoration. In other words, we should lift up our voices and clap our hands and humbly bow before our God. Our worship must also include obedience to God. Obedience to the delegated authority that God has placed in our life. And what I'm trying to get you to understand is that you can't worship God truly. It cannot be sincerely. It cannot be with a grateful heart if you are not obedient to the delegated authority that God placed in your life. For the worship God is to serve as one who is perhaps a slave to God. Such worship and service is done in reverential fear and adoring awe, not grudgingly in face of threat and punishment. In other words, we don't worship God because someone is making us worship Him. Likewise, we should surrender and submit to His delegated authority, not because someone is making us, but because we love God and because we adore Him, because we appreciate everything that He has done, what He is doing, and what He is yet to do. To worship God is to serve God. Service to others grow out of our love and our devotion to God. Spiritual worship includes both obedience to God, amen, through our outward action as well as our inner devotion. Spiritual worship includes obedience, amen, to God and service to God's world. We are to be living sacrifices to God. One theologian cautions living sacrifices have a tendency to slip off the altar. And I said this to you a couple of weeks ago, that if we do not submit to the authority that God has placed in our life, we as living sacrifices will find ourselves slipping from the altar. Do I have a witness?